Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Last week, I did a video about Confederate officer Randolph Harrison McKim, who served on the staffs of Stonewall Jackson and George Stewart. In the video, I describe a meeting where he learns about the Virginia slavery debate of 1831 to 1832. Well, a commenter on the video made a reference to a letter that Robert E. Lee wrote on January 29th, 1861. He was still in the U.S. Army at that point in Texas, and he wrote a letter to his son, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, known as Rooney. And this letter is quite well known. It's often used by historians to support how Lee was torn between honor and duty and service to his state and family or to the Constitution, to which he pledged an oath of allegiance in 1829 when he was just coming out of West Point and starting his career as a U.S. Army officer. That passage from the letter, it's a longer letter, but there's a passage, the relevant passage is usually just quoted just in a couple of parts. And as the commenter pointed out, the entire passage is really worth reading in full to give you the entire picture of what Lee was thinking about in January 1861, prior to resigning his commission, prior to the start of the Civil War with the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Now, before I read the passage to you, I want to mention two references that you're going to hear in the letter. And I think it's better that you know about them now, because when you listen to them in the letter and the passage, I think they'll make more sense. So these two references are common knowledge to political minded Americans of the mid 19th century, but I dare say they're largely forgotten today, or they're just not referenced very often for those who will know that what I'm going to mention. The first reference that Lee makes in the letter is to the Embargo Act, which was passed by the US Congress in 1807. It was an attempt by the fledgling United States to flex its political and economic muscle to Europe, particularly old Mother Britain, who had largely trampled over the rights of its upstart and now former colony. But the passage of the Embargo Act only made the situation worse. And it prompted New Englanders in the larger commercial cities to begin protesting. Throughout 1808 and later on, there's protests going on around the Embargo Act. Thomas Jefferson is president, by the way. Tensions continue to increase because you've got the economic situation in the US is still growing. You have Britain becoming more and more aggressive. And then, of course, the whole thing explodes with the War of 1812. So that's the first reference that Lee makes in this letter that I'll get to shortly. The other reference that Lee makes is to the Hartford Convention. Now, this is a series of meetings that take place in Hartford, Connecticut, between 1814 and 1815. The War of 1812 is in full swing, and New England's Federalist Party leaders are not happy about it. They're opposed to the war. They're calling for various restrictive policies that affect the admission of states and economic controls. And perhaps most relevant to Lee, as you'll find out, there's references made to secession. This is going all the way back to 1814. Now, in January 1815, one newspaper, I'm going to read you a quote, a Massachusetts newspaper, articulates just how dire the situation is and how the United States is coming apart at the seams as it's struggling to survive in a new war, a new nation, and a new war with Britain. Here's the brief from the newspaper. It says, this present is a time of extraordinarily difficult and danger. We deem it our most solemn duty boldly and unequivocally to declare our public sentiments, contending for the unquestionable rights of an independent nation against a powerful and unrelenting foe, weakened by internal divisions, our treasury exhausted, the national credit assailed by domestic enemies, the standard of rebellion about to be raised in this once respectable state, and a secession from the Union threatened by ambitious and unprincipled factionists of New England. Thus situated, our country calls for the united exertions of every patriot, for the active vigilance of every friend to our free republican institutions of government. So this is the clouds of secession over the United States hovering over New England in 1814, 1815. Now, soon after that editorial appears, news comes. General Andrew Jackson has whipped the British at New Orleans. The tide of war turns. The crisis is averted. The moment has passed. Now, whether the New England Federalists had actually intended to push secession to reality is debatable, according to numerous sources. Still, the word secession hung in the air for decades to come. Now, that's the backstory around what you're going to hear. So let me read the passage from Lee's January 1861 letter to his son Rooney. Here we go. Quote, the South, in my opinion, has been aggrieved by the acts of the North, as you say. I feel the aggression and am willing to take every proper step for redress. It is the principle I contend for, not individual or private benefit. As an American citizen, I take great pride in my country, her prosperity, her institutions, and would defend any state if her rights were invaded. But I can anticipate no greater calamity for the country than a dissolution of the Union. It would be an accumulation of all the evils we complain of, and I am willing to sacrifice everything but honor for its preservation. I hope, therefore, that all constitutional means will be exhausted before there is a resort to force. Secession is nothing but revolution. The framers of our Constitution never exhausted so much labor, wisdom, and forbearance in its formation and surrounded it with so many guards and securities. If it was intended to be broken by every member of the Confederacy at will, it was intended for perpetual union, so expressed in the preamble, and for the establishment of a government, not a compact, which can only be dissolved by revolution or the consent of all the people in convention assembled. It is idle to talk of secession. Anarchy would have to be established, and not a government by Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and the other patriots of the Revolution. In 1808, when the New England states resisted Mr. Jefferson's embargo law and the Hartford Convention assembled, secession was turned treason by Virginia statesmen. What can it be now? Still, a union that can be maintained by swords and bayonets, and in which strife and civil war are to take place of brotherly love and kindness, has no charm for me. I shall mourn for my country and for the welfare and progress of mankind. If the union is dissolved and the government disrupted, I shall return to my native state and share the miseries of my people and save. In her defense will I draw my sword. on none. So there you have it. Robert E. Lee's January 1861 letter, the full passage that helps you to give a context and understanding around where Lee was in that really difficult spot. And we can talk about whether or not the decision he made, how that affected his life, the Civil War, the American people, the question of slavery, the question of secession, everything he defined, everything he was referencing in the Embargo Act of 1807, the resistance by New England in 1808, then the Hartford Convention and the Federalists of 1814, 1815, and the mention of the dreaded word secession. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on another episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.